The library
is open.
Historically, we as queer and trans people have been comedic relief on television. Specifically in like a Black queer context, I think of In Living Color, they had this sketch called Men on Film, in which they were just like these hyperbolic, effeminate gay men. And that's not to say there aren't gay men who are like that, but it was like the only type of representation that we got.
In the mid-20th century, into probably the 90s, we were murderous, perverts, not to be trusted. The other side of that coin, too, was that maybe through a more sympathetic lens, we were people to be pitied.
For a long time, trans people were represented in the media as deceiving the other person. Even on the talk show circuit in the 80s and 90s, when you would see trans people paraded around and told to guess their gender. Those depictions were some of our very first time seeing trans people on television. It was harmful.
There is pretty much no representation of intersex people in mainstream media. I can literally count on one hand intersex characters in global television. There's never been a Hollywood film that has an intersex character. Ida Valora was the first intersex person to go on opera, and that had a huge impact in terms of helping intersex people recognize themselves and realize they're not alone.
I remember my first television that I watched that had an all-queer cast was the original Queer Eye. Even with Jay Rodriguez being a person of color, it still felt centered in whiteness. And for me, I was just like, is that me? No, that's not me. It doesn't feel like me. And so I think when I started to watch like Degrassi and saw a character like Marco, that was kind of really the first character that I really identified with.
I'm old enough to remember like when like Ellen had her first kiss and people were having like house parties to watch that happen, you know? Everyone was so desperate for queer content. It didn't even matter, like you probably never even watched Ellen, but you watched it that night.
In the early years, it was a big deal for someone like Ellen DeGeneres to come out on her TV show. But back when she came out on her TV show, you had to be a celebrity who was on a TV show that the gatekeepers of the TV world decided you could be on a camera. What's changed, obviously, is, again, with internet, with social media, with YouTube, the ability for just about anyone to get their voice, their message, their talent, their vision out is endless now.
Karen Thompson has the epic line, "There were no real lesbians on TV until Top Chef." And it's just the greatest truth, because for such a long time, representations of queer people in media have just been straight writers and straight directors instructing a straight actor on how to produce a silly caricature of what they imagine gayness may be. Even today, in our like serious and respectable Oscar movies, so much of the time, we're just dealing with a straight person's best projection of what queer life is like. And I have to imagine that we have the possibility for better than that. The reason I think we had so many of these caricatures is that straight writers and directors couldn't imagine queerness being an aspect of a person's personality who still had a multifaceted and varied life. If a person was gay, that was the entirety of who they were. And maybe that's why Top Chef was so good at showing us real gay people, because it also had to show us them being really good chefs. And it made it an aspect of their identity, not a negligible aspect, but also not something that overwhelmed the rest of who they were.
I think we're moving forward for sure. We're seeing more queer folks than ever in film and in television and the media, even in the world of hosting. Like me sitting right here shows that. Because you would never have seen someone who looks like me in this spot or doing the things that I'm doing 5 to 10 years ago.
I think we're starting to write our own stories. I mean, like the thought of being able to just see regular trans people out there would have been so good for me when I was younger.
Like part of what inspired me to create Original Plumbing with my friend Rocco Kayatis was the fact that I wasn't seeing anybody transmasculine in the media. Original Plumbing was a magazine dedicated to transmasculine culture that was published from 2009 to 2019. As a magazine lover, I wanted to see a magazine with trans guys on the shelves.
Being on IMGate was a wild experience. The visibility that being on a show like that gave, I think, to our community was unprecedented at the time. We were able to really present a multiplicity of trans experience on a mainstream platform. And it's a fascinating document of a very particular time and place. It's, right as the trans tipping point is happening.
So much about our existence as a culture today is rooted in the queer experience and the trans experience. And the reason why folks don't know that is because folks like the Kardashians have been put up as, the standard of creativity and beauty, when their stylists who are gay and their makeup artists who are queer people, the people that they stole from, that they got those aesthetics from, you don't see them on magazine covers. You don't see them in movies. You don't see them on red carpets, right? I constantly think about the Black and brown, queer and trans folks at the center of Paris is Burning. What are they doing now? No one knows, because they have become, these pop culture icons without their humanity being attached to that iconography. But the economic impact of some of these cultural productions never really hits on our community.
The Paris Ballroom, where Paris is Burning was shot, was having drag balls in the 1890s. We didn't appear in 1970. We didn't snap into existence in 1995. We have always been here, and we have always been taking our passions and our loves and turning them into sculptures and turning them into poetry.
Without queer people, popular culture would not exist. Queer people love breaking rules. We do it naturally because we're naturally attracted to people that we're not supposed to be attracted to. So we're rule breakers from the word go. And that is hugely important in creativity. You have to know what the rules are, but you have to have the willingness and the desire to break them. And we fuck things up.
I think it's important to start giving credit where credit is due. And I think if we're going to continue to see more queer media and queer culture in media and in mainstream, let's put faces there that would never get that opportunity.
Now, I do think that's changing. I think of a show like Pose that has folks from the actual ballroom scene. I think of a reality show like Legendary, right, that also has members from the ballroom community deeply ingrained with the production. But I think it's too soon to tell whether or not we've actually, turned the corner. Because what we do know is that more and more, still, our aesthetics as queer and trans people show up without our bodies. It's on the magazine cover, but the person wearing it isn't a black or brown queer trans person, right? It's still, insert white celebrity here.
There is no culture that you cannot find some root within queer culture here, now, or somewhere in the past. Yes, it may be more evident now when you have Harry Styles wearing a dress and earrings to the Met Gala or whatever, but I think the best queer culture understands that it owes a debt of gratitude to queer culture that came before.
Black culture aesthetics and queer aesthetics, and then the intersection of the two, are basically where most fashion influence and style comes from, period. In the past, I could walk down the street and just based on how someone was dressed, I could kind of clock them, regardless of their gender presentation. But now it's confusing because everybody's trying to be queer.
Like when you're seeing a straight cis celebrity with painted nails or in a dress on the cover of a magazine or on a runway, I think that it's actually pushing conversations around toxic masculinity. I think that it's actually bringing up conversations of different ways to be a man. It is like a form of, gay baiting or co-opting, but I do think that it's also bringing up other conversations that are very important.
As queer people, we define the culture. And even more specifically, as Black, queer, and trans people, we are the culture. Everybody wants to look like us, be like us, talk like us, all of it, right? We set the conversation of the day. If we're not talking about it, no one else is talking about it. And then once we start talking about it, everybody want to come take it. That promised land, perhaps, that we might be working toward, the way we will know we have achieved that and that we're there is when the people who are the most marginalized folks who are creating this culture that you want to take, when they also economically benefit from the fact that the rest of the world, right, is able to partake in it.
Gay, 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 gay.